Clap. All right, great. All right, so I'm not going to give you a a super deep intro into um, 3ds Max because that's what you can use the internet for. Um, it is a very, I'm going to say it's a complicated program. I don't want to like overwhelm anybody who's uncomfortable with digital tools, although I'm assuming most of you are reasonably comfortable. Um, like keep in mind that it was like originally designed for like animation in the 80s and has basically been like glommed on with all these different tools and ways of doing things over 30 years and therefore is a very bloated program in many ways. Thank you, Autodesk. Um, so there are certain things that we use all the time, and there are a ton of things that are just sort of not relevant for what we do. Typically, when we're either importing from Revit, which can either come in as an FBX or a DWG, or from Rhino, in which case I um, usually export as a DWG with solids unless there's a reason to do otherwise. Good morning. No, all good. Um, so this is a model that I just imported recently. This happens to actually be Harkness Commons. You guys know what Harkness Commons is? It's it's basically the like lounge and cafeteria for the law school, and it's part of the Gropius building. So we're working on this with Ladalman, Grace and James and company. Um, and I figured it'd be as good a model as any to show you some sort of very basic things that we do. So, um, the way, and I will give you guys a template that has some materials predefined, but basically we've got when you start a model in 3ds, you need to worry about you know, obviously bringing the geometry, assigning materials that are going to be um, photometrically accurate, using physical cameras to see where you're to locate yourself if you're not using just moving around in space, and then putting in lighting. Um, so I will give you this template. I already added a couple additional ones, but um, iRay has its own material definitions, and what you'll see with iRay materials is that they're extremely simple compared to like V-Ray, Mental Ray, whatever, what have you. Um, Basically, the way materials work in iRay is they have a series of presets. We mostly use matte materials or um, glossy materials or glass, and for matte materials, I have predefined in the template 80, 50, 20% and black matte materials and glossy materials, and then a translucent material, a glass material, and an emissive material. So Iray lets us both use daylight, um, photometric lighting, diffuse lights, or using or actually applying an emissive material to a surface so that it becomes a light source. And so this can actually be really useful for if you've got some very complicated geometry. For example, um, this cove here, we'll just jump to the, oh, and it's not even on. So if I've got a cove, I can apply. I thought I had this applied already. I'm not going to worry about that right now. I'm going to change gears and go back to over here. So what I've got in here right now is a couple light sources. These light sources, oops, are just diffuse emitters. So I have them set up as uniform diffuse. Um, very brief. This over here is I think they call it the command panel. The plus is to create objects, and you can choose between um, geometry, shapes or lines, and lights, cameras, helpers, and I still don't know what space warps are after using this program for 20 years. Um, Under lights, when you have Iray installed, you can create a photometric light by using a free light or a target light. A target light gives you a target so you can aim it with a separate element. And if you select photometric and go to Iray, it also gives you the option for a physical sky, an IBL, which is basically you can map a HDR image to use as a background. Um, and I don't use light, so don't worry about that. The other important feature of Iray is that unlike some other rendering softwares, you're only allowed to use um, one sky at a time, like reality. So I have a couple set up here, and I'll give you guys this um, as part of the template. But what I've got set up here is in a 30-minute animation is a preset sun that's already pre-animated on a half an hour time step. So if I down at the bottom, there's a slider for animating, and so I can actually see here. Actually, let's change the exposure value a little. Um, the sun move in real time. So if I now I don't have the sun fully aligned here, and it's missing all the sort of context geometry, but you can obviously see like this is basically serving as sort of a digital heliodon in a way, right? Like I can go into I think I've got a couple cameras. Let me see what I've got here. I can go into a space and see in real time and move around and sort of understand sort of the qualities of light without having to, you know, render a bunch of images and export animations. I can really basically just move around and see how the qualities of light are changing. And if I turn this off, you'll see how grainy it is. Um, for those of you that watched John's lecture, he talked about sort of how grain sort of matches the stochastic nature of light coming into our eye, and that an AID noise script basically can smooth that out. So basically, as I move around, it just in within half a second, it's recreating itself. So I can come back in here and say I want to see what like an early morning quality of light looks like. Obviously, I didn't materialize. Or if I go to late in the afternoon and sunset and sort of see those qualities of light and start designing for them. Um,
Dan,
yeah,
how do you know which exposure to use to be accurate?
yeah, great question. I was thinking about how to explain that. So exposure value here is basically collapsing the camera's aperture, shutter speed, ISO into one value. We've basically developed um, some rules of thumb based off of just experience. And I have these, which I'll share. I didn't pull this in advance, but this is our internal office um, um, Mac stuff, and I can share some of this content with you. Um, where do I have that here? Here we go. So I've got sort of annotations about all the render settings, and what we've found is that typically for exposures, if you're doing outdoor lighting at night, a 2 to 4 range tends to work well. Interior scenes, I typically start with 5 and move up or down a little, and then 9 to 12 for interior daytime and 12 to 15 for exterior daytime. Those values have tended to uh, hold pretty well. Um, but obviously, you can see that like what's sort of missing from this view generally is like the sense of like extreme brightnesses, right? And that's just a factor of the digital environment. Like we can't ever experience like super bright conditions because we're limited by the screen and like the projection and whatnot. So we're ultimately going to have to use other means of data in order to get to that. So for example, I and this is where um, iRay sort of outshines is that we can, oops, oh, we can start to assess this space for quantities of light as well. So here, let me go back and turn off daylight, go back to dusk, or maybe even. So I can quickly start to see how much light we're actually achieving in this space. And I'm realizing that it looks like a lot, in part because I haven't really tuned this model too much yet. But I know we haven't talked too much about quantities of light, um, but if we use a light meter, how much light do we think is on this table right now? Just not knowing much about what light levels mean or are. Anybody? Anybody want to take a guess? 500? 500 lux? Yeah, we'll work in lux. That's so this number right here is, oh, that's why the number is so high because I'm in lux. Duh. Okay, so lux and foot candles are the primary metric of illuminance, and that's basically the amount of light incident on a surface. So I've got a light source here. It's putting out a certain amount of candela. I'm sorry, a certain amount of lumens. Light in a direction is candela. And if our eye sees that light, that's candela per meter squared in um, and that's sort of how we perceive brightness, right? The amount of light incident on that surface, basically lumens per square foot or square meter, or actually steradian, if you want to be precise about it, is ostensibly the measure of illuminance on a surface. And this metric has become sort of the standard for uh, like how we create standards for light in space. You, sir, were very close. I'm very impressed. This is 45 foot candles or 450 lux. Basically, but oh yeah, lux, like metric, imperial. So this is lumens per meter, and this is lumens per square foot. So basically a 10 times conversion. There's um it's 10.7, I think. So like there's 10.7 lux for every foot candle. So if you've got 1 foot candle, it's 10 lux. If you've got 100 foot candles, it's 1,000 lux. So here, now we're seeing about 10. Here, I admittedly think in foot candles because that's how I was trained. Um, Here we've got between 5 and 10 foot candles in that part of the corridor, going down to like 1 to 3 over here. And then on this wall surface, we've got a significant amount more. Let's look at how much we actually have. I mean, we're like really a lot here, right? So how can we use this? Obviously, we can um, uh, take the values and compare them to IES recommendations. So a corridor, for example, might want to be 10 to 15 foot candles. But if I'm trying to figure out how to light this wall effectively, and I want to try and create an even wall surface. Do you guys remember we had talked at some point in the last couple weeks about brightness contrast ratios and numbers? Do you remember where like what's the minimum amount of ratio of light in order to see difference? So like if I've got 3 times, yeah. So between 3 and 10 times the amount of light, you're going to start to see difference. If the goal is to create evenness, then we want to try and minimize that number as much as possible. Well, right now we've got what looks to be like, let's try and get this tuned out, 200. So we've got about 200 foot candles down at the base, and we're down to like 1 or 2 there. So you're going to see that very extremely. Obviously, if I turn that off, you can see that in real space too. But we can use the false color to sort of validate what we're seeing. Oh, you know what? That's why. Um, to validate our model and also understand if the performance that we're trying to achieve is real. Unfortunately, does that make sense? You all with me? Okay. Um, so basically, from the perspective of use of Iray, they also have a number of different other things you can do with render elements. We don't really touch this panel very much, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. Basically, from a practical perspective, you basically just set your output size, keep AI denoise and the Firefly filter turned on. Do you guys know what caustics are? Eric's going to talk about these in the next round, but the short answer is that caustics are when you get that, like, if you put a glass of wine down on a table with some light over you and you see those, like, cool refractions through, those are caustics. And they're computationally expensive, so keeping that turned off unless you're doing something that, with, specular or transmissive materials, um, you want to just keep that off. We just talked about exposure settings. There's also this highlight recovery and shadows. I tend to leave these as just 1, 0, and 1, but you can start to, like if I bring this down to 0.5, you can see how it starts to look sort of hotter, as it were. So if you can just sort of adjust the visibility of those to a certain extent. But I like to just keep them neutral because I feel like our eye does such a good job at understanding brightness and contrast ratios that we want to leave the rendering software as neutral as possible. Um, Color temperature. We've talked a little bit about color temperature. There's 2 ways to adjust color temperature in the view. Oh, by the way, there's you can change what you're selecting by click this. So if I'm going to just click a light, this light source has a photometric web associated with it. So Christine, you had asked a question about IES files in the first class. This is where the rubber hits the road. So this is an IES file. Where's Oh, here we go. So these are all IES files, and I'll give you guys these 2 folders. We have a folder of sort of relatively generic. They're from a manufacturer, but it's means so you don't have to hunt around. Um, these files, if I just open one as a text document, slowly. It's basically just strings of numbers. And in short, the first part is giving you some basic information about the fixture. This series of strings is actually a series of um, dimension, angular dimensions, so that the file knows what the all the information that it's about to read are, and then oh, oh, actually, wait. I'm sorry. This was, yeah, this is all those, see all those angles? So that's 0, 2.55, 7. Those are all the different angles at which this file was metered at. And then all of these numbers are candela readings around that fixture taken from the goniophotmeter. So if I now open that file in we use a software called Photometric Toolbox, which is very old and antiquated, but there's another one I'll show you. Basically, I can see that's what's called a photometric web. So it's basically showing me the distribution of light out of that fixture if that really dark blue area was the light source. And you can see, so here's that those numbers in chart format. You'll also see a photometric web often displayed as two dimensions like this. And what we're actually looking at is two different distributions. Two different orientations. The blue line is cutting through that photometric web um, sectionally, and the purple is sort of the plan view of its widest peak. And it'll probably be easier to show you this if I look at a couple others in parallel. Oh, shoot. So here's one. What do you think this fixture would do differently than the one that we were just looking at? More pointy? Yeah, what's another way? What are some other ways to what?
Spotlight?
Yeah, more yeah, basically it's a narrower beam. So like it's taking that light and just narrowing it down more. And so if we compare those two together, we can see oh, this is super annoying. Actually, I'm not gonna do it this way. Do it like this. So here's three different beam spreads. We've got one that's super narrow. That's a 9 by 9, so that's 9 degrees by 9 degrees. Then we've got a wider one that's 40 by 48, so it's slightly asymmetric in that or slightly non uniform in that you're getting slightly wider distribution in one axis than the other. And then the third one, which is a 15 by 23, is showing a much more wider distribution in one orientation than the other. Why do you think we might use something like this over one of those other ones? Imagine this is like a narrow linear fixture. Yeah, so in our design here, if I'm putting a fixture really close up to a wall here, if I change this distribution to like a really wide distribution, I'm probably gonna get a lot hotter down at the ground surface. Yep. And a lot less, a lot more fall off quickly. Oops. So let's duplicate that. If I then change that to a really narrow, actually, I'm going to close it. It doesn't do anything. What the hell? Oh, this photometric was a little screwy. Yeah, there we go. So now it's so narrow that you can actually see the streaks of light going up it, but you can see that the individual source is actually traveling much further up the wall. So this is sort of one of the many things we can do is just like testing different distributions of things. Um, that all make sense? Yeah. Um, Obviously, there's another aspect of the photometric the photometry is sort of the I know why it was screwy. So when you make a photometric fixture, there's like a lot of stuff over here on the right hand side. In fact, most of it is not all that useful. Um, Shadows doesn't. Oh, and the reason why is because so 3D Max has sort of a standard interface for a lot of different parts of the program, but different rendering softwares don't or can't necessarily take advantage of all those things or have their own. So in for iRay, and this will be different if you use 3ds for V-Ray or any other rendering software, but for iRay in particular, light properties, the on off works targeted. If I click targeted, it will. Oh, I'm not going to do that because it's going to screw up. But it'll. What the hell? It'll give a target so you can aim the fixture. Shadows don't do anything. Distribution we just talked about, and you can just click that button, and it'll also give you that little image of what the object is. Intensity, color, and attenuation does work. So I started to talk about color temperature and it got sidetracked, but this number only will only correlate with like real life color temperature if the white balance of your full image is also uh, relatively aligned with the real space. So if I have this space set to the standard with the default, which is D65 noon daylight, that means that the white balance of this image is really aligned with midday sunlight, daylight. But there's no daylight in the scene. If I and because of that, the fixtures that are listed at 4,000 Kelvin look pretty warm. But if I make this more realistic to what the actual space is, well, now that's like gone a bit over the top. Sometimes I will drop it to 5,000, which to me looks a little more realistic to things. But yeah,
To the products in your life, is that pretty standardized? Like you model it here and then you know what to buy?
yes. So if I'll take a quick detour into real life. So let's say I go to a light fixture manufacturer. The first one that comes up is Lumenpulse. So this is Lumenpulse is a very big company. They make all sorts of products, ranging from linear products to track and a lot of outdoor stuff, really high quality outdoor stuff. So if I select this fixture and scroll down all the way to the bottom, you will find that they've got IES files available for download. And when I download those, a lot of times now manufacturers are doing these digitally. So, there's two ways to create an IS file. You can either take a fixture and put it in a goniophotmeter, which is basically a light meter for measuring the light at all the different angles, and physically measure all those angles. Or you can use a program like Photopia. There's a couple others that manufacturers use where they can digitally create those files. And what happens is they'll create a different file for literally every single configuration of the fixture. So that means every single different color temperature, every single beam spread, every single like snoot accessory variation. And so you can end up with literally thousands of files for every single version, which can be good because then you can know exactly what you're getting. It can also be kind of a pain in the ass to wade through, which is why, especially for early design, I feel very strongly in starting with blobs of light until you know that you need a beam that somewhere that you've organized it, and until you start to actually like figure out what manufacturer you're going to go to. My goal with this class was not necessarily to get to the level of like specification, but if that's something that you're interested in, like we can definitely go there. Um, but all that being said, if I um, extract all of these, each one of these files is like a couple kilobytes, and like it just becomes a ton of stuff. But now I can, similarly to what we were doing before, open that file. And so this is an interesting one that's much different than what we were looking at before. This has got what's called a bit of a batwing distribution. That's also, we'd also characterize this as forward throw because what the intention is it's sort of similar to like a street light where imagine the fixture is here, but you want to light a street that's that way, and you don't want any light thrown behind you. So these optics inside of here are actually designed to throw the light forward and outward to try and maximize your distribution on the street. Um, so that particular fixture that we were looking at, this thing actually is kind of a unique fixture in that it comes with just a ton of different distributions. It can be a spotlight, it can be a street light, it can be all sorts of things. Um, what else was I say? Oh, one other side note. There is a photometric viewer that you can download for free that I will post on the website so you can actually see these without having to get photometric toolbox, which you're not going to be able to get easily.
So in design, you design with the IES file, right?
Yeah. So, oh yeah.
And after you've settled on the design, what do you do then? Do you go through every product and find the matching IES file? Or
Um,
that seems so.
so in the case of this project, for example, yeah, we will literally test different IES files, test different manufactured products, figure out what makes the most sense for that installation, and then when we document the project, oh hey, come on in. Um, Eric, this is Eric and his wife. Um, I'm giving them about a sort of a crash course in 3D Max and Iray and sort of prefiguring some of the more fundamentals that you're going to talk about. Um, but yeah, so then we will then develop a fixture schedule, which is literally all of the information about that particular product. So I can go and then find theoretically an IES file that matches this exact model number or all the parts that matter from an optical perspective. You know, the fixture's finish is only going to matter if the optical distribution of the light source is seeing any of that finish, right? So like if I have a downlight, actually I'll do it as a cylinder. Here's my cylinder. It's on a stem, canopy, it's matched to a junction box. Inside of that fixture is a cone, an LED light source with some optical elements on it, some crap inside for heat dissipation, a driver and power source that is tied back all the way up. So I we have to specify all these different things, right? We have to specify the finish, we have to specify the dimensions, the finish of that, the optics, the color temperature, what kind of driver we're using. What's the finish on that? Is that a stem or a power cable or an aircraft cable with a separate suspension point? So there can be anywhere from, a couple to 15 to 20 different specification elements that we need to verify. From the perspective of the IES file, though, we really don't care about most of these things except for what's happening right here. So if this is a medium distribution that's 40 degrees, and this surface right here is specular aluminum, that's going to behave differently optically than if this was a 20-degree beam and that surface was black or white. So the different IS files need to account for all those different conditions, because basically the way to think about an IS file is that it is a model of a light sources distribution that's making it easier to do these calculations, because historically, and Eric, you'll probably talk about some like historically, doing what we're doing here is very computationally expensive, especially without a GPU. So an IES file is a shortcut to basically be able to model the distribution of a light source. However, I could actually build a complete light source, soup to nuts, starting with an LED chip as a diffuse emitter, putting a, the geometry of an optic on top of that chip, some sort of cone elements, and model the rays traced all the way out of that source using iRay, which we do on occasion, usually just to get the visual effect of like a baffle or something that an IS file doesn't can't show. But that's kind of a pain in the ass, right?
Iris can do ray tracing as well.
Say again?
Iris can do ray
It's
tracing.
only a ray tracer.
It's all
Yeah. So it's using um, ray tracing as a to within a photometrically accurate, validated simulation engine. So like V-Ray actually is also a photometrically accurate visualization engine. The problem that we've had with V-Ray over the years is it's just like unnecessarily complicated, and Chaos Group is kind of a pain in the ass to deal with. So like we have a couple seats of Enscape for looking around in Revit models, but we don't use that for rendering because Enscape is taking shortcuts, right? It's not actually doing all of the full round of calculation that is necessary to create photometric accuracy. And you'll see that if you look at the false color, especially with electric lighting, that there's things. So, it can be helpful to actually go through some of your or your if you're doing using Enscape at all, look at some of your renderings and like look at how they match or don't your modeled spaces. Does that all make sense? Cool. Um, I don't know if there's really much else initially that I wanted to cover here. I mean, obviously, like, there's an unending amount of things I could show you with 3ds, and I'll show you more in 2 weeks. Any other questions? And then maybe we'll transition or take a 5-minute break, and then Eric can present. Does that sound good? Cool. Um, quick bathroom break, and we'll keep moving.